at the initial part of the outbreak of COVID, we started looking at what the impact would be. And if I can now work out how to share my screen, here we go. I can put up a short presentation. It's not going to be very radical. Here we go. So what we did at the very beginning of the outbreak was to, right, can you all see that now, Jacob?
Yes, we can.
Oh, cool. So what we started to talk with our members about the impact, and you know, for those of you who are looking more internationally, obviously the impacts in North America were pretty dire early on, and so we decided to organize a webinar for our members, and we heard from all of the different segments in the chain. So we had producers, we had processors, and retailers, and we had also Justin Sherrard from Rabobank giving a sort of more long-term strategic overview of what that might be on the protein sector. So we talked about the next normal and what are the lessons from uncertainty and confusion. Now, obviously, some of these points that I'm making, you know, we're a few months down the line now, but what we talked about at the time was the initial big bottlenecks in the supply chain, which you saw in the US particularly, but in other countries as well, and the impact also that had on retail. And we had a very interesting scenario that you'll all have probably seen as well, where retail markets for things like primal cuts, suddenly there was an oversupply in New Zealand, certainly of primal cuts, and we had very cheap prices in the supermarkets because none of that was going into the food service, and there was less export as well. At the same time, in certainly, again, North America, this was most particularly felt. There was a drop in household income because of large increase in unemployment there. And that did obviously impact people's ability to buy. Again, oil price dropping as a result of lack of demand had a further impact on the prices of feed corn. And so input costs were lower, but there was a huge inventory sitting in the feed yards, which couldn't be shifted. So you saw a drop in the prices of cattle. In most of this is obviously related to North America, but overall that had a tremendously negative impact in North America on the industry. It also really upset the relationship between the processors, the packers, and the producers. And I would say that there was a period there, and even continuing now, where that relationship was really at a low ebb compared to what it had been, and it wasn't particularly brilliant before that. What we heard from the retail sector, and this was a perspective of Leon Moll from Ahold Delhaize, is that you know, obviously there was a shift. There was almost a compulsory shift in behavior. Ahold Delhaize is both big in Europe, but also in North America. And there was a big shift to online. That's not necessarily because they weren't allowed to shops, but it was a lot of people opted to go online. So there was a sudden big increase in online retail. And there was a shift amongst the consumers to buy local. He didn't outline the particular reasons for that. It was just a sentiment thing. People thought that they could trust local more than they could trust anything else. And it definitely led to a shift in consumer perceptions in terms of systems. So there was an increased interest in, I would say, more extensive or low input or organic or any of those kind of things. So basically, that was the shift that they saw. There was also a big skew in the sort of assortment that people were looking for to buy. And of course, the classic example of that has been a shortage of supply of some things like toilet paper or flour, but it had a knock-on effect in all kinds of lines, and it took them a while to cope with that. And, you know, because of that, the logistics of their whole chain, I mean, they were upset by the changing demand, but they were also upset by the fact that, you know, logistics companies were also trying to deal with the virus. Consumers were really interested in increased transparency at this point and started asking more questions about where their food was coming from and how it was being processed. And what Leon saw was that led to a sort of spike in interest in sustainability. In terms of what his company does as a major retailer, he didn't see it having a long-term impact on their sustainability strategy. He thinks maybe it would contribute to a little bit of momentum, but the direction definitely wouldn't change. Then we had the sort of outside players, people who are not really members of GRSB, but you can see all of those international bodies, the G20, the World Bank, OECD, and so on, all started to look at livestock, and there was an increased reporting on the relationship between livestock and zoonoses. I mean, not that in this case livestock had anything to do with the pandemic, but suddenly there's been a definite increase in the level of interest shown into the role that livestock systems can play and how to avoid zoonoses, because while this one definitely didn't come from livestock, I guess all of these bodies started to think that there might be potential for that in the future. So that's a sort of overview of what we heard from our members. We do have rather a strong North American bias because of our membership profile. We do have representatives from 22 countries. We do have people in other regions, and the major processor that we heard from was in Latin America. They probably faced the same issues that Australia faced and New Zealand certainly faced in terms of exports and the problems with logistics that they caused. So Minerva Foods, who was the company that reported to us on their impacts, really was suffering from just a big slowing down of the supply chain from Latin America to other regions. And since then, the virus has really taken off in Latin America, as you'll have seen, Brazil, but also Argentina, and all of that has impacted on their work in slaughterhouses and processing plants throughout the region. So that's a brief overview, and I certainly welcome any questions that you've got about our membership's perspectives on this.
Thank you very much for that, Rory. And I do encourage everyone to please write your questions into the chat function there. That will be administered, and I'll be keeping an eye on that as well. We will just move on now. So Tamara has been dropping in and out. I've seen her name come in a few times and out a few times. So Sarah, are you okay to jump ahead as well?
I am.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sarah. So I'd like to introduce Sarah Hyland now. Sarah manages the development of the sheep sustainability framework. However, her background is in fast-moving consumer goods and consumer insights. So Sarah, I'll now pass over to you, and you should be able to share your screen.
Okay. Stand by. All right. I'm hoping everybody can see a slide that says consumer sentiment research.
We can see 4 slides at the moment, Sarah. So we can see you.
Really?
There we go. That's the one.
Okay. So a singular. Okay. Thank you, Jacob, for introducing me. And I'm an understudy for Emma Gillingham. So Emma Gillingham is the Domestic Insights Manager for Meat and Livestock Australia, and she was unable to present this morning, so I am standing in for her. This is a 10-minute presentation, and that means it's a bit like the free app that you get on your phone. There are in-app purchases, but I'm not offering any today on the interests of time. So it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the highlights of this research that we conduct every year. So I will proceed. I'm going to very briefly set the industry context, which you probably don't need, but it's good practice to do so. I'm going to be touching on some of the big measures around consumer sentiment and the red meat industry in Australia. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the key findings about understanding vegetarianism in Australia. Industry context. Well, we need to always be very mindful when we send surveys out to the general public about what is going on in the world, in Australia, and in their lives at the moment. This particular study gets conducted every June. So since last June 2019, we've had these three very significant phenomena take place globally and specifically in Australia. So everybody is clear about the drought that has persisted over the last couple of years. We've had significant impacts from our bushfires in January, and of course, as we're all familiar with the pandemic that has swept the globe since the early part of this year. So taking into account that is what is going on, or in the background or in the foreground of our consumers' minds as we survey them. One of the first questions that we ask is, how concerned are you about these three big issues? So we can see that we have data here because it's a tracker from 2014. So we've looked at it over the last 6 years. And straight away, even if you're in the cheap seats, you can see something going on with the red line there. And the red line is concerns about the economy. As you can see, from September 19 up to March 2020, we can see that our concern around the economy has increased significantly. Typically, concerns around society have been fairly steady, usually at around 67 to 71% of respondents saying that they are extremely concerned or very concerned, and concerns around the environment have stayed somewhat steady but have been showing a bit of an upward tick in the last few years. But let's get a little bit of context still about consumption. So beef has extremely high penetration. It's up there with Coca-Cola, quite frankly. 95% of Australian households buy beef, and they buy it about 23 times a year. What are they most likely to buy? They're most likely to buy mince. 76% of Australian households buy lamb. That's around 8 times a year, and typically they're buying legs and chops. And that's from our Nielsen home scan data that is a moving annual total. The other fact, or the other part of the context, is how has the price been going in terms of beef and lamb compared with other proteins? And we can see the line at the top there is lamb, followed by the green one that is beef. And these are numbers from April 2018. And you can see that compared with chicken, lamb and beef have been steadily rising, and the prices have been rising at a higher rate than pork, for example. So looking at the price index to chicken, lamb is 215 and beef is 184. So it's 1.84 times dearer, and lamb is just over twice as expensive as chicken, just to put that in a pricing context. Now let's touch on some of the highlights of the consumer sentiment research proper. And why do we do this research? Well, there's a few reasons. It's really useful for us to understand the community sentiment towards our red meat industry. We want to get an idea of how big and what kind of worries there are underlying meat eaters, specifically those who are reducing consumption, and identify the incidence of claimed vegetarians How many people are real vegetarians, whatever that means, and what are their concerns around the red meat industry? What do we use it for? Well, it's a really important source to inform the community engagement strategy that MLA run, addressing community concerns, but also we want to understand the impact of our programs on building consumer trust in the red meat industry. That is why we do it every year. Okay, so how do we do it? It's a 15-minute online survey. It's conducted across metropolitan Australia, about 1,500 main grocery buyers and meal preppers aged between 18 and 64, so it's adults. We conduct it annually in June. It's been running for 10 years now, and it's conducted by an agency called Pollinate, and they're a market research agency, and we do that to make sure we have confidentiality around a third party and that they're managing the data in a safe and secure way. All right, so headlines are this. The industry perceptions are largely positive. So most of the community has an overall largely positive perception of the red meat industry. People, the community, are hearing more positive messages about beef and lamb, particularly around industry standards and the positive economic impact that the red meat industry has. Excuse me. And more specifically, perceptions around sustainability and ethics have improved. So just to put a few numbers and visuals across that, so we can see perception of Australian producer industries amongst meat eaters. So amongst people who are eating meat, how do you feel about each of the industries here? How do you feel about the beef industry? 67% of respondents say, you know, I feel very good or good about it. And you can see across the columns there, it hasn't changed much over the last few years. Similarly with lamb, this year, 62% of respondents say, yep, I feel very good or good about the lamb industry. And that hasn't moved very much over time. In summary, awareness of positive messaging is up. So more people are aware of positive messaging, but it's only 50% of the sample have heard something positive about the Australian red meat industry. In 2020, they're definitely hearing more about high standards and the industry's positive impact on the economy. Awareness of negative messaging is flat. So it hasn't gone up, but it also hasn't reduced. So about 40% have heard something negative about our Australian red meat industry. And the negative messages are usually around animal welfare and anything to do with live export. So putting a few numbers and visuals around that, here are some statements you can see listed on the left-hand side, and it's split by cattle and sheep. So the dark green is the cattle. So Australian cattle farmers make a positive contribution to society. 63%, absolutely, yes, they agree. They care about the environment. That's the next set of statements. 55% say yes. Now, Australian beef is environmentally friendly and sustainable. That's 53% of the sample. And the lamb industry is doing all it can to reduce its impact on the environment, 49%. What are those green arrows doing over there on the right-hand side? Well, that tells us that since last year, that the number of people who agree that Australian beef is environmentally friendly and sustainable has significantly increased. And similarly, it is significantly increased from the number from last year responding to doing all it can to reduce its impact on the environment. And that's true for the beef and lamb industry. So that is a very positive result. We are specifically about perceptions of ethical and humane treatment. So Australian cattle farmers are ethical and trustworthy. 56% strongly agree or agree with that statement, and that's significantly up since last year. And similarly, are farmed and raised in a humane manner is significantly increased from the figures from last year. And that's across the board. That's for cattle and sheep. I'm going to touch a little bit now on knowledge, perceived knowledge of the industry across our community. So perceived industry knowledge has increased overall, but they know less about the specifics. Here's a question where we asked, how much do you agree or disagree with this statement? I have a very good knowledge of understanding of the Australian beef and lamb industry, beef or lamb industry. And both of these understanding numbers have come up since June 19. You can see there for the Australian beef industry, that's the gold line. It's increased from 24% of the sample up to 30% of the sample. For lamb, it's increased from 20 to 27%. So they have a good knowledge and understanding of the industry. But when it comes to specifics, there are also more people who feel they don't really have a lot of understanding. So the question was, how much do you agree or disagree with the following statements about yourself? So the three were understanding of the industry's environmental impact, that's the blue line. The purple line is little understanding about welfare and ethical issues in the lamb industry. And then the green one is welfare or ethical industries in the issues in the beef industry is the green line. So you can see that last year it was 44%. So there's been a significant, there's been an increase since last year, significantly across all of those three questions about how little I understand. So more people feel they understand less than they did last year. In terms of consumption, we still know that consumption of red meat is stable, and most respondents have not reduced and are not planning to reduce. So the proportion of red meat reducers is pretty stable at less than 1 in 3. Because this question is, okay, which of the following best describes how often you eat red meat now compared with 12 months ago? Do I eat it more often, unchanged, or less often? So it's been consistently sitting in the high 20s, early 30s, well, 31% we got in June 17 and December 2010. It's about the same, as is eating more often or unchanged. So for those who are consuming less often, tell me why. So we know that around a third are consuming red meat less often. What are the main reasons? The first reason is, well, it's too expensive. The next most common reason were concerns around health, then came environment, and then animal welfare research, concerns, animal welfare concerns. Let's look a little bit about this concept of vegetarianism. So the number of people in metropolitan Australia who claim to be vegetarians has remained stable for the last 4 years. So are you a vegetarian? Around 7% of our samples said yes, I'm a vegetarian. Okay. So, great. Let's ring fence the people who say they're vegetarian. Do you eat any of the following? Well, about 68% of them eat dairy, around 60 to 70% eat dairy, 60% eat eggs, around 30% eat fish. I'm a vegetarian, but 1 in 3 of those would occasionally eat meat or chicken. And certainly 40% would eat fish, seafood and chicken and occasionally red meat. And probably only about 20% of the people who say they're vegetarians would actually not eat any meat. So this tends to suggest that even when you claim that you're a vegetarian, you're actually probably a flexitarian. Let's get into the hardcore now, which is the idea of veganism. So the proportion of vegans is small. The total incidence of vegans and true vegetarians, so those who eat no meat at all, sits at around 4% in metropolitan Australia, which isn't actually very much. Because as it turns out, it's pretty hard yakka to be a vegan or a true vegetarian. That requires a lot of commitment and a lot of planning and a lot of taking into account nutritional needs and a much narrower range of food that can be less satisfying from a flavour delivery point of view. Also, there are social issues connected with that, but that's a talk for another day. So in summary, red meat perceptions are improving in terms of our industry. So it's been a rough year and it's only August. Despite a pretty tumultuous year, the red meat industry has managed to grow or certainly maintain positive industry perceptions. And consumers are hearing more good news about the industry and increases in positive industry perceptions around sustainability, environmental impact and animal welfare. They know more, but also less. So perceived industry knowledge has increased, but when it comes to specifics, they're kind of feeling a bit more uninformed. Red meat consumption and reduction is pretty stable. Overall meat consumption is stable over time. Beef has enjoyed a penetration of 95% in the Australian market for some time, and we certainly see our rates of consumption staying fairly steady over the last 5 to 10 years. And even the portion of people reducing red meat in the community is pretty stable. Cost and health are really important, and environmental impact and animal welfare are becoming more prominent. And the proportions of vegetarians and vegans is also stable. And many vegetarians eat meat on occasion. They're the terms of use. That's the end of my presentation. I hope it hasn't gone for too long, Jacob.
That's been fantastic. Thank you, Sarah. And with Tamara dropping in and out, there's no need to worry about going for too long. So Tamara does pass her apologies on, as her internet has been dropping in and out. We are trying to be very flexible here. I'm just going to throw to Tess. Tess, are you okay have you got the slides, and are you okay to share Tamara's slides on her behalf?
Absolutely, yep.
Excellent.
I'll do that now.
I'll pass over to Tess Herbert, who will fill in for Tamara and do what she does best and present on the views of the industry. Thank you, Tess.
Thanks, Jacob. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you for your presentation, Sarah, and thank you, Rory, for the global perspective earlier. So my name's Tess Herbert. I'm the chair of the Australian Beef Sustainability Framework. It's stepping in for Tamara in the light of the technical issues, and I hope I do her presentation justice. So Tamara, if you're listening, get back to me if I don't. And as a previous RMAC director, I feel I can have some input into the presentation as well. So the Sustainability Steering Group that I chair is appointed by RMAC, and RMAC really drive the process that we undertake as well. So just having a quick look at the presentation, we're quite aligned to the themes that both Rory and Sarah discussed in theirs, but I'll go through this with you. So she goes through the initial pandemic response, first of all, public health economic responses. We, at the same time, had just developed our Red Meat 2030, our strategic plan for the industry till 2030. And that means that the whole industry developed a structured approach with our partners. The first stages, shock and reaction, the middle stage, lockdown, adaptation, and the final stage, the gradual shift to the new normal. The transition to the final stage has begun, but obviously we're anticipating and experiencing further pandemic waves, which are currently occurring in some parts of Australia. So our response as the red meat industry to ensure strategies are in place to mitigate the risk to the employees and businesses within the red meat and livestock industry in Australia, to ensure continuity of our domestic and international markets, and provide a clear and available framework for coordination of pandemic-related activities for immediate, middle and post-pandemic. So the messaging from this slide is that the industry is prepared for what is happening to our domestic markets, our global markets, and what is happening within our own red meat industries. Changing customer behaviours are examined in the next couple of slides. And again, these align with the global messages that we're hearing. So in April to May, COVID-19 crisis saw a surge in domestic retail demand. And there was change in purchasing behaviour. So those of you who shop and visited supermarkets madly searching for toilet paper or red meat, at that stage, you could see that those changes in purchasing behaviour. In particular, we noticed with red meat that it was going back to certain cuts and certain types. For example, minced meat was a big seller. So there was some level of turning to comfort foods. By June, there were financial security concerns, increasing pressures on household budgets. That was a key driver in purchasing behaviour changes. People were at home more, they were cooking more, they were preparing their own food at home, or as Rory identified, there was increased online ordering of food. There was a sustained demand for finished cattle over the April-June period. The MLA research that Sarah was talking about confirms that consumers gravitate to brands they trust in a crisis, and they're particularly looking for branding about sustainability during this crisis. Aussie red meat, as high quality, safe, ethical and sustainable, again would have been the sort of branding that consumers would have been turning to. By July, softening of beef retail compared to April-May, however, still ahead of last year. And by August, the shift to home consumption is more entrenched. That's the new normal, settling into that. And export figures still demonstrate enduring demand for safe, sustainable quality beef. There are challenges though with our export, with access to markets, with freight and logistics concerns. So some of those will have an impact on those figures. Changing customer behaviours. So our low numbers of COVID-19, it's allowed the industry to carry on largely uninterrupted. And that is evidenced by the people that you talk to in the industry. There are obviously differences along the supply chain. For example, the processing industry has been impacted, and at some levels supply of inputs has been impacted for producers as well. What's important for industry is to build capabilities and resilience to deal with what scenarios could happen. The recent Victorian outbreaks and restrictions to some red meat businesses, there's a 33% reduction in the peak workforce required as they're cutting back, and overseas examples of difficulties maintaining food supply, workforce networks can impact on our ability to maintain our sustainability outcomes. So considering how we continue to build value and work around that, and I take my hat off to the red meat processing sector for their ability to function through these really, really challenging times. So this is our framework approach post-COVID-19. Key policy areas. Red Meat 2030, which directly references our sustainability frameworks, both the sheep framework and the beef framework. The sheep framework now very nearly ending its consultation stage, Sarah?
Yes, our second consultation stage. So we're nearly ready to do our second draft, and then public consultation will be in September.
Right.
Mm.
So it's exciting to see that framework moving forward. So the beef framework, we've been reporting for 3 years now on our trends in data against our indicators. So it's a key red meat industry strategy to advance those frameworks and support their adoption, ensuring that the whole supply chain works within agreed and coordinated sustainability frameworks, using the beef framework as an exemplar, just because we were the first cab off the rank. In post-COVID-19 sustainability world, this becomes even more critical. Again, the messages that we heard earlier globally about people shopping locally, looking for brands that they can trust, will be mirrored in the work that the sustainability frameworks do. So key alignment policy areas from Red Meat 2030, becoming world leaders in ag environmental management and stewardship, our carbon neutral target by 2030, doubling the percentage of project funding for extension, becoming an employer of choice, and setting the standard for world-class animal health, welfare, biosecurity and production. Problems, challenges, headwinds. Supply will remain a major challenge. We're still into our herd rebuild after our drought from last year, and there's limited availability to slaughter animals, and our slaughter of our breeding stock continues, which makes that herd rebuild even more challenging. cash flow issues for businesses, business day-to-day decisions versus the slow burning issues. And you could think that sustainability is a slow burning issue, but in fact, as we're emerging from the first wave of the pandemic, it's becoming more and more important to consumers and customers. Tailwinds, what are our opportunities? Renewed focus on who produces the beef and how they do it. Consumer preference for brands with purpose and broader community benefit, and continued improvements year on year on our priorities, creating forward momentum. And again, if anyone listening hasn't accessed our most recent report, relaunched in June this year, you could access on our Sustainable Australian Beef website. So our 2020 annual update, which I just mentioned was launched in June, we showed industry achieving major sustainability milestones despite those challenges and despite the fact that we couldn't meet face-to-face as a framework. I still have not met Jacob in person, but we've had multiple Zoom meetings.
Neither have I.
It shows that's evidence that the collaborative framework approach works. So reaching out to industry, but also reaching out to our stakeholders and listening to what they're telling us and what their influences are telling them. Worldwide, businesses indicate that they will use COVID-19 as an opportunity to lean in on sustainability, and sustainability will remain a priority, as evidenced by the key priorities in Red Meat 2030. So ARMAC is committed to driving forward the longevity and prosperity of the Australian beef industry. And I'll change that, Sarah, for you to the red meat industry from paddock to plate.
Thank you, ma'am.
This involves long-term strategy and proactive thinking. With the framework's guidance, our red meat industry can continue to produce sustainable beef that's environmentally, socially and economically responsible. And I hope I did that justice for Tamara in her absence. But again, any questions that anyone may have, feel free to add.
I think that was fantastic. Thank you very much, Tess.
Jacob.
Okay, there have been a few questions come in, so I do thank those who have put those questions in. Stacey, I'll answer the first one. We had about 13 people respond to the survey. It was only sent out on Monday to the people who had registered prior to Monday. So I think that was only about 30 at the time. We ended up with about 66 people registered for this webinar, and I think we can see 35 people online. Rory, a question for you. You have answered a bit already from Jenny in regards to what is your perspective of different responses around the world. And you came back saying it seems that trust is a key issue to have emerged. Are you able to elaborate on how that and how you've seen that emerge? You're on mute. Sorry, Rory.
Sorry about that. Right. Yeah. What I mean by trust is really that return of consumers to looking for things that they know. So in other words, those local products, those brands that they've known, even the shops that they've always shopped at, but also a request for increased transparency. So, we've heard about the implicit trust in Australia, 95% penetration, I think it was, of beef. People know beef, they like it. And what we're seeing is that they want to trust it. They want more information so that they can feel justified in that choice. And particularly now with all kinds of other uncertainties, they just want to know a bit more than they previously did. And so that translates into a request for increased transparency. And I think the way Justin Sherrard put it in his presentation was that we're going to see that reflected in what consumers demand from their retailers and what the retailers demand throughout the chain in the future.
And you've seen globally a few bits and pieces of messages coming out about methane production still. Yeah.
So the thing about methane is it's what they've heard. So I'm not sure that consumers are specifically that bothered about methane. Most people have no idea what that actually means, but they've heard that methane is an issue, and so now they're asking questions about it. And the fact is, there are a huge number of people out there who are willing to continue to play the methane card against the beef industry because they've got all kinds of other reasons for wanting to negatively impact on the beef industry. So whether they are, more activist in terms of, just wanting people to stop eating meat, or whether they've got another product to sell, so all the plant-based alternatives, they're very keen to talk about the methane emissions from livestock because they see that as a selling point for their product. They're not so keen to talk about the environmental footprint of their own product because it's not well understood, and they would rather just stay that way. So I think that the fact that consumers are asking about methane is not necessarily related to a real desire to understand climate impacts. It's just because that's the negative thing that they're hearing the most of. You will be aware of the fact that the Guardian newspaper, for example, was paid about £800,000 to run a series of negative articles about the meat industry, and they don't tell you on these articles that it's a sort of advertorial. They just say this is an article by the Guardian, even though it was paid for to be negative about the meat industry.
And I guess that reinforces the importance of initiatives such as the Australian Beef Sustainability Framework to continue getting the true message out there and build that trust and transparency.
Absolutely.
And on that note of trust and transparency, Sarah, how do we improve the confidence and knowledge of what we as an industry are doing in regards to environment, animal welfare and health benefits? I know you have some very passionate feelings and opinions about that.
Do I? Sorry, what was the question again? Is it written down?
Yes. How do we improve the confidence and knowledge of what we as an industry are doing in regards to environment, animal welfare and health benefits?
The confidence and knowledge of what we as an industry are doing. So the confidence and knowledge amongst the community or ourselves?
Jenny, are you able to clarify that?
Yeah, just with your survey, I still think that's pretty low. I think, ranges from 55 to 49%. So how do we lift that? What can we do? I know MLA does some amazing stuff with nutritionists around nutrition, but I personally don't think that's a good enough figure, and I'd love to see that higher. So
yes, absolutely. How do we do it? That's a good question. So absolutely, it's one of the roles of Meat and Livestock Australia to promote Australian red meat. And certainly, if we look at our Meat and Livestock Australia 2025 strategic plan, which of course I have with me at all times, when we look at our 6 pillars, sustainability is in pretty much every single one of those foundational pillars in some way. So I think the one about raising awareness and understanding in the community about what we do with environment, animal welfare and health benefits is an ongoing job. And it is one of the key roles of domestic marketing and also our communications group to do that. So I predict that you will see in those specific strategies more activity around highlighting the benefits of our industry in terms of carbon storage, for example, all of the projects in our CN30 program, of which there are 7 around emissions reduction and 4 specifically around carbon storage. In terms of animal welfare, we can see that transparency is critical, and that's one of the jobs of the framework, whether it's sheep or beef, to be very clear about what our animal welfare practices are and being open and honest about them and communicating what our intentions are around improving those figures. So it's a panorama, if you like, of activities that we need to do. And I think one of the challenges of the industry is around the question of vulnerability. So in order to build trust, one of the best ways to do it is to show yourself to be a bit vulnerable. And I think the frameworks are one of the main vehicles for that. But the frameworks are not actually targeted at the community. That's actually an industry project in many ways. So I would say that being open, honest, being clear, also having our messaging be reiterated many times in ways that are very accessible and palatable and not intimidating, and positive, I think, is the way to do it. But it is the $64,000 question, Jenny, and it's a really good one.
And
Sarah, we do those ads on the telly. I guess if you're looking at the general consumer, and the lamb ads have been enormously successful. The beef ones, I perceive, they have been sending a message around health, iron and zinc and some of the old women and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder whether there'd be an opportunity with particularly the beef one to see if there was a clever way they could bring some of those environment and welfare things in, because we've taken the nutrition one, but we haven't ever tried to promote that more broadly. And I do see that's our biggest investment in targeting the broader community. And the online presence with those ads would target the younger generation as well.
That's right. And one of the things that I have been talking to Lucy Broad about just on Monday, actually, she's our new GM of communications. One of the very positive themes that I saw amongst red meat reducers, actually, when I ran a bunch of groups at the end of last year across a number of capital cities, and certainly what we've been seeing in our Trust in Ag project that's being run across a number of RDCs, is that rural communities are extremely important and very well loved by people in metropolitan areas in Australia. And I actually think there's a story there that we can develop and understand a lot more to generate the positivity around our red meat industry, certainly from an environmental point of view, but the fact that it can work in with that idea of the humanity of our rural communities and how important they are to our culture is probably one of the messages that we could really develop quite well. And when I do talk to producers, and I talked to them about this at the end of last year all across Australia, they really dislike the struggle town story of rural communities. They prefer the strong, resilient, working hard and overcoming adversity stories. So there could be something in those insights. I think, my personal opinion, I think there's a good opportunity to develop that a lot more. It's also my opinion because it's based on qualitative and quantitative data that I have.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And there's a lot of chat in the chat there about animal welfare and where the concerns lay and how we can promote that a bit better, especially in regards to other industries, such as what we saw in your presentation about the vegetarians often going into other agricultural industries and consuming things such as dairy and eggs. So that is something that the Sustainability Steering Group is looking into over the next year, is a deep dive into animal welfare and husbandry techniques. So hopefully we can, through that, we'll be able to find a bit more of an industry perspective and industry understanding on how we can move forward in regards to those items that were raised, such as pain relief, nutrition, and allowing them to have all their freedoms. Just aware of time, there's probably one more question that I do want to address, and it kind of hits on what Roy has just shared with us in regards to the recent UN Act Now campaign in regards to eating less meat. And Steve Benny has actually asked, do we know enough about Australian producers' sentiment towards sustainability? So Tess, if you're still there, I think you might, and if you're happy with answering this question, I think you might have some insights around that question.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. So, to be honest, Sarah might be better at consumer sentiment towards, or community sentiment towards sustainability. But I'm linking this in with another couple of questions on the chat as well. So ours is a very customer-facing document. It's done with in consultation with industry to hopefully bring them along on the journey with us. But I'm sort of referring a little bit to Melina's question in there as well, which is the purpose and the vision of the document itself and our definition of sustainability. And to be honest, I agree with lots of what Melina has just said about why we have this framework and why we are even looking at sustainability in our industry. It's about becoming a more trusted source, a food source, a trusted source of protein that people are comfortable and even excited about consuming because they trust that it's consumed in an ethical and sustainable, produced in an ethical and sustainable manner. It's not about getting people to eat more of. though for a lot of our businesses, and I'm in the red meat industry business too, that would be ideal, but it is about addressing the issue of where people's concerns are around our product. What are they concerned about? Can we measure that in our indicators, and can we provide them with evidence or answers to their questions about our practices? Because, and Jenny maybe pointed this out in some of the advertising, as a producer, it sometimes feels to us that it's missing. Our message is missing in the chatter about what Rory said about methane, about our impact on the environment. Our story is missing, and I'll use the term, our verified story is missing in that debate. So I applaud those people who respond to issues like the UN Act Now hashtag, as Rory has done. In Australia, our response was through our Minister for Agriculture, who directly quoted several data points from our beef framework in response to that. And that's how I would like industry to see the framework, as a tool that they can use when they get claims about our production systems or our product, which we feel have holes in them. You know, there's a problem with that claim. It's more complex than that. No, that's not what the industry is doing. Here is the data that backs this up. And that's the value of the frameworks. And to Melina's point as well, this is a continuous improvement process. And industry acknowledges that. And Red Meat 2030 acknowledges that the purpose of the framework is to drive that continuous improvement. We're not standing still, we're listening, we're consulting, we're engaging, and if we need to, we're acting as well. Through our R&D, through our producer adoption, all of those are parts of the framework and our response to consumer and community concerns. Probably doesn't answer your question directly, Jacob, and floated around it a bit, but...
That's all right. Thank you very much for that, Tess. Just aware of the time now, so we will just move on to our closing statements. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we will revisit 2 questions that we had in the pre-survey. So the survey is now open for anyone who wants to just go in and quickly fill it. It's simply 2 questions. Just head to any web browser, type in sli.do, and when it asks you for the event code, type in ABSF2, and there should be a survey there with 2 questions for you to answer. So I'll just see if I can share those results as they come in. So hopefully you can see the results now, as we've had 2 respondents. So there are the 2 questions there, so make sure that you answer both of them so we can get the best result possible. So there are 30 people online still, so I'll give it a bit longer to see if we can get some more responses through. And already we can see a bit of a change here in regards to how we view ourselves across Australia compared to the globe. Previously, we thought we were about 2/3 that we were all different, and at the moment we're sitting about 50%. And the confidence has actually dipped a little bit. I think it was around 7.6 before, but it's climbing back up again now. Let's let that go for another couple of 30 seconds. I guess the positive out of this is that no one is feeling very low confidence at the moment, but there are obviously a few people who are sitting around that 5 or 6 mark. Overall, an average of 7.4, not too dissimilar from what we saw prior to the webinar. and we're still sitting about 50% where we believe that we are a bit different to the rest of the world, and about a quarter not sure and a quarter aligned. That survey will remain open for the rest of the day, so even if you don't get to it now, please do go in and head to sli.do and type in ABSF2 for the event code. Now, just checking, you can see the presentation again. Yes. Okay, thank you very much. Today has been the second of a series of 5 webinars that we're undertaking for the Consultative Committee in August, obviously to replace the normal one-day forum that we will be holding. We have another 3 coming up, so the same day, and same day of the week, Thursday, and the same time as always for the next 3 weeks. The next week's webinar on health and wellbeing of our people is again open to everyone, as is also the webinar 5, International Markets and Trade, on Tuesday, the 3rd of September. Please ensure you do register for these ones. I can send the links out again because the link for today's meeting won't work next week. Apart from that, once again, I would like to thank very much Rory Petre from Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, Sarah Hyland from Meat and Livestock Australia presenting consumer sentiment, and also Tess Herbert for filling in at the very last second. Thank you very much, Tess, for filling in on behalf of Tamara, Badenoch. And without much further ado, I think we're about 5 minutes over time, so thank you very much for your participation today, and as always, we hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll be in contact again soon. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jacob.